We're here with Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, and I think we'll kick things off with some questions about the opioid issue that is front and center now nationally. We're having a Take Back event this weekend. How important is this problem to you, and what are you doing legislatively to fix it?
It is, Anna, enormously important, and particularly in rural areas. You have older people, very often veterans, who may have, say, chronic health care conditions, and they get caught up in opioids. And Orrin Hatch, he's the Republican chair of the Finance Committee. I'm the ranking Democrat. We're working on legislation right now to deal with it, and I'm particularly concerned about what I call the prescription drug pendulum. It used to be you couldn't get pain medicine for example, older people who were suffering. Now we've gone 180 degrees the other way, and you can get all kinds of pain medicine, even if you have some maybe more modest problem. We've got to get that balance right. That'll be a priority of my legislation. And
what's the timeline for that legislation?
Soon. I mean, the clock, incredibly, is really ticking off for the session this year with the elections, certainly to be very contested in November. So this is going to happen in the next couple months.
And, you know, something that I've heard from veterans is their frustration that because they're stuck going to the VA, oftentimes prescription meds are their only option. So there are veterans I personally know who are like veterans of Vietnam who have issues, and they want to seek alternative pain treatments. Does your legislation, or would your legislation address that issue?
I hope to include that. It's something I feel very strongly about, because clearly the whole point of American healthcare is to create this sort of continuum of choices, and opioids may be right for some people, particularly if you get the right number of medicines at the right time, but increasingly people are looking for non-opioid alternatives, and I support that.
Would you support non-opioid alternatives such as cannabis?
Well, I have been the sponsor of taking essentially the Oregon legislation national. Senator Cory Booker and I have proposed national legalization, yes.
I think it's interesting that you are a senator from Oregon. Obviously, there are other senators now with states that have legalized marijuana recreationally, but because of it standing still as a national, illegal drug, that does put you in this crossroads, this in between.
It does, and the Trump administration looks, in my view, incredibly hypocritical, because they're always talking about states' rights and the beauty of the 10th Amendment, but then what they're really saying is that they're for states' rights if they think the state is right, because they want to hold us back in terms of carrying out the will of Oregon voters on matters like legalization, medical marijuana, those questions.
Would it be realistic to think that any kind of legislation that would loosen federal rules on marijuana would go anywhere, given the current state of the makeup of the House and Senate?
If I had to predict it, Anna, I think more and more states are going to act as Oregon did. I mean, California did, and California, because it's such a large state, I mean, we're increasingly seeing a significant portion of the American population living in jurisdictions that have actually voted for legalization. So I think you're seeing a lot of momentum behind this.
Okay. As far as opioids go, and maybe you have a better feeling for this because of all the town halls that you do, but what do you do for addicts who refuse to get clean?
My sense is the overwhelming number of people do want to turn their life around. I mean, we're seeing so many dimensions to this issue that we've never seen before. I went to school on a basketball scholarship. I think I told you I dreamed of playing in the NBA. It was a silly idea because I was too small, and I made up for it by being slow. But when you threw your knee out in my day, nobody got addicted to painkillers. And I hear from parents all the time now about one of their sons or daughters, high school junior, dreaming of getting a college ride, and some particular sport, threw their leg out, went to a party, had some alcohol, got involved with opioids. All of a sudden now they have a big addiction problem. So I think the overwhelming number of addicts do want to get clean.
So you're talking about this legislation, but what would be one of the specific strategies to bring things better into balance?
Well, one of the other areas I'm concerned about are these federal advisory boards, because these federal advisory boards have really been stacked by people with a financial interest in making sure that a lot of opioids are used. I actually fought a couple of these boards, and we've actually had people thrown off as a result of it. So if you want to get a more balanced approach, make sure you have federal advisory boards. Those are the people who are making recommendations on what to do that aren't stacked in favor of those who have financial interest in their use.
So is that included in the legislation you're working on, or are there other tentacles that specifically go after pharmaceuticals?
That will be something I'm going to push very hard to make a part of this legislation. And because I have spoken out so frequently against these federal advisory boards, I think I've got a fair number of senators on both sides of the aisle who will support it.
Okay. Anything else in terms of specifics on opioids?
Well, I think the federal advisory boards, getting the prescribing patterns so that they're more balanced, right, and also not giving short shrift to folks in rural areas. Those would be three of my priorities based on what I hear at my Oregon town meetings.
Moving on to North Korea, a huge time right now. I don't want to ask you the obvious question, you know, is this more style over substance? But I guess that really is my question. At this point, is this more style over substance? I mean, is there anything really meaty in the current diplomacy efforts that give you hope toward a denuclearized North Korea?
Here's my take on North Korea. I root for America. And so I hope that just maybe there's a real breakthrough here that would leave the United States and the North Korean and South Korean population safer. The fact of the matter, though, is the Kim family has a long track record of being able to get the whole meal. And what that means in this case is that they get more foreign investment, they would get relief from sanctions, and we wouldn't touch their nuclear weapons and missiles. So what I want to know right now is what are we bringing to this other than the placemats and the silverware?
Right. And so when you say breakthrough, how do you define breakthrough? And what is your definition of a denuclearized North Korea?
What obviously would be an enormous breakthrough is if Kim is really serious about denuclearization and cutting back on his missiles. Now, I find it very hard, really far-fetched, to see him doing that, because with his economy in such bad shape, it just doesn't seem very likely he's going to do it. I mean, I think if he had his way, what he would do is he might get a Trump Tower in North Korea, he might get a bunch of McDonald's and fast foods, he'd get a lot of foreign investment, and he would be able to keep his nuclear weapons. We're not going to be able to go along with that.
And that wouldn't sit well with you?
I would never support that.
And so the point at which we're at now with North Korea, has it surprised you? And how much credit do you give President Trump for any of that?
Well, I sit on the Intelligence Committee, so I know the intelligence with respect to North Korea. I can't get into it, so I'm not surprised at how advanced they have become in terms of their weapons capability. I think the president can say, look, I put a real focus on this issue, more so than administrations past. Now we've got to see if something actually gets accomplished. That'd be how I'd sum it up so far.
So you're not surprised that we're at this point? And what have been the primary factors then in getting to this point, do you think?
This president made this a much bigger issue than previous administrations. So he can say, I brought them to the table. He can make credibly an argument that that was the case. But that's not the same thing as reaching an actual agreement. And the track record with the North Koreans in the past is not very good. The track record of the North Koreans has almost always involved they get something that would benefit their economy, relief from sanctions or more foreign investment or something like that, and agree for holding back on their weapons development. Then after they get the agreement, they cheat, and then they come back and try to say, you've got to give us something else in order to adhere to the original agreement.
So what you would sign off on are some pretty concrete accountability structures in place long-term with North Korea.
What I always thought made the most sense, and this is kind of the traditional approach, is each side takes a modest step. For example, Kim agrees to hold back on the development of some of his weapons. We agree to hold back on military exercises in the region. Something like that always struck me as a kind of building block.
Right, instead of the extremes. Okay. You mentioned the president's tweets today regarding Senator Tester and Ronny Jackson. I'm not actually aware of that.
Essentially what the president said is that John Tester, the Democratic point person on veterans, ought to resign. And to me, when you have somebody say that somebody ought to resign because they're doing their job, which is what John Tester was doing, really says more about your qualifications for public office than it does about John Tester's.
And that's tied to the Ronny Jackson?
Yes. What happened specifically is John Tester, with the support of the Republican chairman of the Veterans Committee, raised questions about the qualifications of Mr. Jackson.
I see.
And that's what apparently has so angered the president.
I see. And you take offense to that, why?
Again, John Tester was doing his job. He was asking questions about this person's qualifications. And if you look at exactly the unfolding of the process, in asking those questions, he had the support of the Republican chairman of the committee. So it seems to me we should be saying people who do their job, stand up for the veterans, make calls on their merits, are people that we should think more favorably about rather than ones who get the kind of tweets we saw from the president.
Do you have concerns about the White House and its vetting process for nominations?
Yes. I think clearly somebody up at the White House lost the vetting manual. They lost vetting 101 because so often we've had these cases where literally days after they have made a nominee, we have all of these questions come out, and sometimes there is a sense that they're losing people so fast, pretty soon the president's barber may have a key position in foreign policy.
We had some viewers who wanted to know about sea lions and what you're doing to get the sea lions under control.
We're beginning to have discussions with our congressional delegation because the problem really looks serious. We seem to have lost a lot of our winter runs, and there are a variety of laws involved. And I've begun talks with members of the Northwest Congressional Delegation, but we can't sit by and lose so many of these salmon runs. And I understand you had an experience where you thought you had a salmon, on the line, all of a sudden a sea lion gobbled it up. So.
Yeah, all I reeled in was actually the head. That shouldn't influence your legislation on this, but it was a pretty traumatic experience.
You might have to be a witness.
No, I can't do that. But like we were saying, though, it is so interesting because it is a multifaceted issue. There are people who very much believe that these sea lions have the right to go where the food is at. But there are also anglers and fishermen on the other side trying to make a living or trying to recreate. Guides, for example, who are very much affected by the path that these sea lions have taken up the river.
What we've always done in terms of our Northwest Congressional Delegation is tried to look for a win-win situation, which in this case is making sure we protect our salmon runs and try to be sensitive to the sea lions. In this case, it really looks like the problem has just gotten out of hand, and there are laws that make it possible to come in and deal with that.
Would you support lethally affecting the sea lion numbers to balance out the issue?
I want to talk with my colleagues about how to deal with this. I know what's going on can't continue.
Okay. Had a question from a viewer about Backpage and human trafficking. So Backpage shut down. Another 130 sites are now open for business. Law enforcement is saying other factors should have been considered before passing the legislation to shut down Backpage. Do you agree? And what is next?
Well, there's an awful lot of confusion about what's really going on. Backpage could have been prosecuted under the old law. That's what's really important. The reason why is the old law said websites got no protection if somebody was involved in an illegal act, and Backpage clearly was. So Backpage could have been prosecuted under the old law. The real answer here is to have more prosecutions and to send a real message of deterrence. What I'm concerned about now, on the basis of this, this new law, is basically what you're going to do is force these traffickers over to the dark web. The dark web is essentially a place you can't get to through traditional search engines. And I'm concerned that this new law might be well-meaning, but I think it could end up driving a lot of the really dangerous people to the dark web, and it would be even harder to protect vulnerable women.
So is the funding in place to go after
yes,
those folks?
I actually offered an amendment to substantially increase funding for prosecutions, and I'm going to keep pursuing that.
Okay. What specific regulations are you considering in relation to Facebook? I know that was big news a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, I'm particularly troubled about Facebook's refusal to acknowledge that those who do business with them control their own information. You know, they really have it set up so they can make plenty of money on advertising, and basically somebody has got to go through a lot of steps to essentially get out. It's called opt out.
Right.
I think before they use your data, if they're going to use Anna's data, you should have to, at the outset, formally state, I am giving you explicit permission to do it. It's called opt-in.
Right.
And what you get with an opt-in arrangement is essentially Anna gets to control her own data, and I think that time's long overdue.
Have you done anything along those lines, or is that not something that's in your purview?
Well, I wasn't on the committees that interviewed Mr. Zuckerberg, but that has long been my position. I've been very involved with technology legislation, and for your viewers, we've got a big issue coming up, and that is net neutrality and protecting net neutrality, which essentially means after you pay your internet access fee, you get to go where you want, when you want, and how you want, and the Trump Federal Communications Commission is trying to unravel that.
Here's an interesting question, and it's pretty broad-reaching, but how do border policies affect income inequality, homelessness, and housing costs for low-income Oregonians?
Well, that covers a lot of ground. Certainly, what we are seeing now, because border crossings now are at their lowest level in years, and it's really striking where the president wants to have it both ways. He wants to say, oh, we've got to do more at the border, but border crossings are actually at their lowest level in years. So I think the economic impact, and there certainly is one, is less than, say, there would have been several years ago.
And why do you think that is?
Well, I think a couple reasons. One, obviously the president has gone to great lengths to say that he was going to put more people at the borders and there'd be a much stronger deterrent. I think that certainly as we look at various economies around the world, sometimes when things are going a little bit better, then there isn't the desire to come. But if I had to pick one factor, it would be that the president has sent a really strong message, and I support strengthening what we do at the borders, and I'm just struck how the president wants to have it both ways. He wants to say, we've got to do more, the country's being threatened, and then half the time he says, well, border crossings are down. I should get the credit.
Right. What can you do to help with public school K through 12 funding? I know you've talked about community colleges and universities in the past. Can we talk a little about K through 12?
Sure. We pay for education differently than most parts of the country because the federal government owns most of our land. And we always used to get a big check for our schools tied to cutting timber on federal lands. That money essentially disappeared a number of years ago as the environmental laws changed. I just got the law re-upped for 2 more years, and that money comes into the Common School Fund. So I think that's going to help. I obviously support other programs. I'm a big supporter of STEM education, and I support STEAM education, which incorporates the arts. But the big thing in the last couple of months is we got re-upped the law that essentially brings us money into the Common School Fund as a result of the fact that the federal government owns so much of our land.
Yeah, I read about that. I have 2 last questions.
Sure.
Both are from viewers. Why are you unwilling to work across party lines on anything this session? Is that true?
It isn't, and I'm just an Oregonian. I call them like I see them, and I'll give you an example. In the last few weeks, I supported Jerome Powell, who is the president's nominee for the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is arguably one of the most important appointments the President of the United States makes. And I took him a fair amount of flack, for doing it. But I looked at his record. I thought he'd be independent. He had worked well with the previous head of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen. It's one of the most important appointments the president makes, and I just voted for the president's choice.
Is it more important, though, to you to stick to the party lines in this environment than in others, considering the makeup of Congress right now?
Anna, I have something I call the Oregon way, and I'll take a good idea wherever I can get it. I always try to find common ground, because if it's bipartisan, you're in a better position to make it stick. But you just asked me, a viewer said, why do you oppose, Trump all the time? I just mentioned a key appointment just in the last few weeks. So I call him like I see him. I think that's the way Oregonians like it.
Last question for you, and actually several people asked this. Do you think that it might be time for term limits?
Well, the Founding Fathers had a great idea about term limits, and they talked a lot about term limits, whether there ought to be restrictions, and they decided that the best term limit was something called an election, and that people really ought to be able to make choices. So, I've always said that my job is to be accountable to Oregonians. I just finished my more than 880th town hall meeting, where I just go out and let people ask questions for 90 minutes. I think the Founding Fathers did a pretty darn good job in terms of coming up with sort of the ground rules, the principles for our system of government, and I'm interested in sticking with them. Oh
my gosh, I can't believe I forgot to ask you this, but I can't let you go without asking about baseball. I know that you're a baseball fan,
I'm a sports fan.
Sports fan in general.
You and John know that. Look, I love the Blazers and the Thorns and the Timbers, and I think it'd be wonderful if we could get a baseball team, in here. Now, there are tough choices to be made, because if you come to one of my town meetings, you'll hear parents say, hey, my kid's in class size, it's too big. We got to have the money go to the schools. So there's some real questions with respect to, public money, but I'd love to find a way to have baseball here.
I know there's opposition to the idea of any public money being spent, but would you at least support public money, even federal funds, around infrastructure improvements and such to support a stadium?
Well, we got to get infrastructure for our city, and this is another area where there's been a missed opportunity. We had bipartisan support in the Finance Committee for taking some of the repatriated money, the money in the tax bill that would come back to the country, and use it for infrastructure. Administration wouldn't do it. So I'm trying to find a bipartisan coalition to get some of that money back, and you use that money for infrastructure in Oregon, it's certainly going to benefit Portland.
Mm-hmm. Would you support federal money to improve infrastructure around a stadium?
I'm not sure I would do it just for a stadium. I think it would have to have a larger economic, impact. This is going to be something we're going to have a discussion about as Oregonians, because if you love sports, as I do, then you got to say to a parent who's concerned that their kid's in a school where they're not getting enough attention because of class size, that you're going to prefer another use over that. So there are tough choices here, but certainly as part of my effort to help build infrastructure in Oregon, that's been one of my priorities as a senior guy on the Senate Finance Committee. I think steps can be taken, for example, in the Tri-County area, that will benefit the economy and certainly give a boost to sports too.
Have you had conversations with the Diamond Group or anyone with this group?
I haven't had any recent conversations, but certainly folks who have been interested in a baseball franchise over the years have come to me often, and I've always tried to promote sports in Oregon. I think John remembers back when Larry Weinberg owned the Trailblazers, and they sent me over to talk to the Russians about Arvydas Sabonis, and that was an experience.
I bet that was an experience. All right, anything else you wanted to share?
Covered a lot of ground. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for your time.
You too.